Recently, just a month ago, Mr. Herbert Stein, a member of President Reagan's Economic Advisory Council, gave it as his opinion that in his experience, 35 to 40% of the US government's expenditure was totally useless to the nation. Mr. Leslie Chapman, a past servant of the civil service in UK, has recently written a book called Your Most Obedient Servant. You know, in England, the government official addresses you as dear sir so-and-so and ends with the words, your most obedient servant, whether he means it or not. And Leslie Chapman reported that his experience in the Treasury, he was in with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, his experience in the Treasury was that about 35 to 45% of government expenditure was wasted. So this is a phenomenon you have to live with when you are dealing with the government. My earnest suggestion to the government would be, if you are really keen about poverty eradication, which first of all economically is an unsound practice, because you only try to remove the symptoms instead of removing the disease. Try and remove poverty, not the symptoms of poverty. And the only way to remove poverty is by increase in the national economy. But anyway, assuming you want to eradicate the symptoms of poverty, it's not eradication of poverty, but eradication of the symptoms of poverty. Give your plan to a good, well-run organization like Ramakrishna Mission or the missionaries of charity, and let them do the job. Not a rupee will be wasted, unlike the millions which are just swallowed up in governmental programs. Let me just end with one more quotation. Take the economic survey which was published 10 days ago. In the economic survey it is written that the authors of the economic survey advised the government, and I am quoting the words, to prune ruthlessly all those schemes which are of doubtful social and economic merit. To prune ruthlessly all the schemes which are of doubtful social and economic merit. Well, the economic survey would not make such a suggestion unless there are schemes which are of doubtful social and economic merit. But do you think the government listens? No. In fact, this sentence is not even quoted in any of the speeches. What is said in the speech is that government is making every endeavor to keep the expenditure to a minimum. Anyone can say that. I know of businessmen who fly their own private planes who say that they keep the corporate expenditure to the barest minimum. It all depends on what your yardstick is. How do you want to measure the size of your own operations and the size of the cut that you have sought to effect? Let me come to the third point, the deficit and the consequential inflation. Till 1979-80, India had annual budgets in none of which was there a deficit on revenue account. In other words, till 79-80, the government collected the revenues and spent whatever the revenues warranted. In 79-80, they started the practice of having a revenue account deficit. That means that the income of the government is not enough to pay for the day-to-day running expenditure. They have to draw on capital with a view to provide for revenue expenditure. It is exactly the same as you or I living on our capital because our expenditure exceeds our monthly income. It can happen to most of us that the expenditure does often exceed the income, but then we feel ashamed of it. And we say, how can we keep on living on capital? But the government is totally unconcerned. You won't find one word of regret. In fact, it is not even noted. It is the economists like Mr. D.R. Pense and his bright boys and girls who find out that these are the details and they give them to me. But for the government, for the ordinary layman, he won't even know what's happening. In fact, when I see this kind of gathering, I tell myself people come because they know that they will be told the honest truth, that there will be nothing to be gained by the speaker from trying to flatter the government, and nothing to be lost because there is nothing that I have to hide. Now the point I was making was that this practice of deficit on revenue account is most pernicious. You can live 1 year on your capital. How can you keep on living on your capital every single year from 79 to 88, 89? And mind you, you accept it as a fact of Indian life. So the net result is what? In the next year, the deficit will be 10,000 crores of rupees. Budgeted, mind you. Out of that, about 3,000 will be taken from the capital. Therefore, the budgeted deficit will be 7,484 crores of rupees. Now, 7,484 crores is the highest budgeted deficit in the history of this country. Are you all complacent about it, or do you think there is some danger? The highest budgeted deficit is in this budget. And if you read the budget speech, you find a degree of self-confidence, a degree of complimenting everybody, the soldiers, the farmers, the industrialists, everyone is complimented. So everyone is happy. And small reductions here and there, what I call the soporific effect, and what Mr. D.R. Pense calls a sedative budget. I say it puts you to sleep, and Mr. Pense says that it numbs your faculties so that you can take in your stride what may be otherwise very difficult to accept. This is the deficit, and this deficit is what? It would amount to, as I said, the largest deficit in our country's history. But the real point is that it will be exceeded. In the history of India, in the last 15 years, no budgeted deficit has remained what was budgeted. Except in 1 year, in every other year it has been exceeded. Therefore, do you see the dangers that we are facing? And do not be surprised if suddenly you find inflation descending upon you. It comes without a warning. Please remember that. It's not as if it comes bit by bit, 5% and then 5.25% or 5.5%. Suddenly you will find the country engulfed. Just think of the market crash of the 19th October all over the world. In 1 day, 24 hours, all the different markets of the world suddenly collapsed. And the share prices dropped 25% on an average in 1 day. Did anybody know the previous evening? No. Some people like Mr. Batra may have predicted in the Great Depression that some depression was coming, but nobody knew the date. Imagine if in the whole world, in different countries, you can have a crash. The shrapnel is still hitting some people in different parts of the world. Shrapnel arising from the crash of the stock exchanges. If it can sweep across the whole world without 1 hour's warning, do you think India will have months of warning before inflation begins? Most people have short memories, but if some of you remember what happened in 73, when we had 22% inflation, did any one of us know before that it would be 22% inflation? It just came suddenly in 1 year, and the nation was taken unawares. Luckily, we had first-class civil servants at that time in charge, and they averted the disaster which would have otherwise overtaken the country. Now, this is the great danger. Again, I will end on this topic with the words of the economic survey itself. The economic survey says, the great rise in governmental expenditure involves serious risks of inflation. This is the economic survey for the next year. Please bear it in mind. You will not find it in the finance minister's budget speech. This, to my mind, is wrong. I would suggest that Parliament must pass a Taxpayers' Rights Act. And in the Taxpayers' Rights Act, it must be provided that anything detrimental to the national interest, if it is a matter of public record, like the economic survey, it must be brought to the notice of the people. You can't keep it secret, but it is kept secret. Who reads the economic survey? It's the most dull, depressing document you can ever come across, unless you are an economist. It makes no sense. You will be fed up reading 3 lines of it. So people don't read it, and therefore people do not know what advice the government of India has received. It has received this warning that there is a serious risk of inflation, but it has chosen to ignore the warning.